Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of our grief workshop. Thank you for being here. Yesterday, I shared the short story Grief by J. Ruth Chandler, and many of you expressed in our circle how impactful that story was for you, and I'm glad it was very impactful for me as well. It actually reminds me of another story that I'd like to share with you today. It's a Buddhist parable, the parable of Kisagotami. Sorry about the pronunciation. Also known as the Buddhist mustard seed parable. And basically what happened was Kisagotami had one child who sadly passed away, sadly died. And she was completely overcome with grief. And so much so that she went through the village carrying the lifeless body and going up to all of the other villagers, begging them to help her revive her child. And now the villagers thought that, maybe she had lost her mind with grief. And at least one of them advised her to go ask the Buddha. So she went to the Buddha and asked the Buddha, please, revive my child. To which the Buddha responded, I will gladly revive your child if you can bring back a spoonful of mustard seeds from a house in the village that has never experienced the death in the family. And so she goes from house to house, begging for this mustard seed. And in the process, the villagers begin to share their stories of the death that they had experienced in their house. Because of course, we all experience death, right? We all have experienced or will experience someone in our family who's very close to us dying. And through that process, she begins to connect with her empathy and her compassion for these other people and their experiences, realizing that she's not alone. She's not alone in her suffering. This is something that is kind of part of life. We all go through this. So she goes back to the Buddha, who begins to teach her, and she becomes his student. So I wanted to share that story because besides the obvious teachings on empathy, compassion, and the inevitability of suffering, there's also a lesson in there. It also teaches us about the importance of community and relationships when we're experiencing grief. Back in 2016, my brother-in-law was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma, which is a very aggressive form of cancer. And I was living in Nebraska at the time, going back to school for a physics degree. I thought I was going to be a physics teacher, when my sister called and was like, please come back to Denver, please come back home, I need you, I need your support, I need you to be with me and my niece. And so, of course, everything changed. I dropped everything and moved back to be with my sister and my niece. And yeah, it seems like on one hand it happened so quickly because he passed away within 6 months of his diagnosis, just days after his 47th birthday. And for us on the outside, looking in. So me, my brother, you know, my parents, it seemed like he went so quickly. You know, it was just 6 months and then he was dead. But for my sister, it was, the experience of time was different because she was his only caretaker and was with him every day, you know, witnessing this decline, which to us seemed like it went really fast, but to her, it was almost impossibly drawn out because it seemed like every day, you know, she was experiencing something new and just tragic. And it was really hard for her. And something I learned about grief while going through that process with my sister is that, you know, while it's often talked about that there are different stages of grief, it's kind of misleading to think of grief as happening in stages because it's not a linear process. Grief doesn't just, oh, it starts here and you feel these stages and then, oh, you're done. Grief is more like, it's like waves. It happens in these waves and cycles where one moment you'll be living life doing, you know, whatever task you're doing, and then just out of the blue you're reminded of that person or an experience or something like that, and then it'll just hit you in that moment like a wave crashing on the shore. And the stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, I like to think of as more of like phases of grief, if you will. It's almost like these are the ways that we cope with our grief when it appears, if you will. And I noticed that with my sister. But one of the most important medicines that I noticed in going through this experience with my sister was the importance of the presence, you know, of me and the other people in her life that were just there. You know, so often people don't know what to say, or they feel like I better not reach out because I might say the wrong thing. I might make it worse or something like that. And in actuality, that causes a lot more suffering and loneliness for the person experiencing grief. In my experience with my sister, you know, a lot of times you don't need to say anything. Just letting them know that you're there and that you're willing to listen to them and witness them while they cry or get angry, and just be a loving presence, you know, that will help kind of hold the space and hold the process of their grief, their process for them, is the most important thing we can do for those that we love. It's interesting because while going through this, I had begun school at Naropa, and so I was learning a lot about Buddhism and Buddhist psychology. And my sister, in her process, came across the philosophy of Stoicism, which is an ancient Greek philosophy that is very similar to Buddhism in many ways. But one of the big takeaways for my sister was this idea in Stoicism called memento mori, which is basically the idea that to remember your mortality, right? To keep in mind that one day all of this will pass away. One day you too will die. And it's a similar idea to the whole yin and yang, where the yin is the white side, but there's a little black dot within it, and the yang is the black side with the little white dot in it. And it's this idea that no matter what we're experiencing, light or dark, there's always a touch of the other present within whatever you're experiencing. And for an example would be like, you can be having a really fun time, enjoying yourself, but then when you realize, oh, the day's almost over, or this fun activity I'm doing is almost done, there's like this little tint of sadness that's present in the recognition that this will fall away, that everything will fall away, that we too will pass and die. And the Stoics taught that keeping memento mori in mind was a way to actually deepen and enrich your experiences, because it allows you to actually savor the moment instead of being distracted by projecting your mind into the future or remembering the past or something like that. It actually helps to bring you in touch with the present moment and savor it a little bit more. It also reminds me, just as a fun note, I was watching the movie Inside Out with my daughters, which is about emotions. It's a kids movie that kind of teaches about emotions, and without spoiling too much of the movie, there's one point in the movie where the emotion of joy realizes that the experience of joy was intimately attached to the experience of sadness. And it was because of the sadness that the joy could come in and be felt, right? I like to think of it as like grief and sadness and those painful emotions that we experience. They like carve ravines in our hearts. They similar to the erosion on the earth. There are these cuts made in us that we can then fill with the rivers of love, if you will, right? Because the sadness gives us a depth to our experience that helps us to be a little more present and deepen and enrich our experiences by not taking the good ones for granted sometimes. So for the next segment, I would like for you each to take a moment to recall a time when you experienced grief. And it doesn't have to be the most intense, saddest, most painful grief experience that you've ever felt. Just something that you'd like to work with, something that you would like to be able to surface so that you can be witnessed and process, and eventually move through it. In school, we always talk about how the only way out of strong emotions is through, by feeling them. So what we're going to do is you're going to recall this moment of grief, And then we're going to do breakouts, and we're going to have groups of 3, and it'll be a 30-minute breakout session. So each person in the group of 3 will have 10 minutes to just be witnessed in their grief experience by each other. And if you are having a hard time coming up with a grief experience that you'd like to process and let go of, that's fine. You can use the time to talk about whatever we've talked about so far in the workshop. How you feel about the stories that have been shared, and how, my talk has made you feel, or whatever. And then after that 30 minutes, we will come back together and do a group sharing. So thank you so much for listening and participating today.